So yesterday we were talking about a sukkah on top of another sukkah, and we were explaining that based on the psukim, are we rolling? Sorry. Yes. Based on the psukim, such a sukkah is puzzle. The Gemara's question now is about 8 or 9 lines down. Kama yehe on DAF Yud Amud Aleph. Kama yehe bein sukkah l'sukkah utehei tachtona pesula. What is the height of the upper sukkah? There's how much gap must there be between the upper schach and the lower schach in order for the lower schach to be considered to be a sukkah underneath a sukkah? So the answer is we have 3 different opinions. Amar Rav Huna tefach shekein matzinu bi'ahalei tuma tefach. So the most machmir position is that even if all you have is a 1 tefach vertical space between the lower schach and the upper schach, that's enough to create an impediment for the lower schach and to render the lower schach no longer kosher. And how do you know that? Because when it comes to the laws of Tumah, we find that a 1 tefach airspace, like we learned in our Sugya share Monday night, creates a blockage for Tumah. Ditnan, tefach al tefach berum tefach, maybe a satuma, v'chotzeitz b'fnei hatuma. Aval pachos merum tefach lo mevi v'lo chotzeitz. So the halacha is as follows. When it comes to the laws of Tumah, we know that there's something called an ohel. An ohel can sometimes block Tumah, and it sometimes can collect Tumah and make it part of an entire structure. Let's say, for example, you have a plank of wood that is 1 tefach wide and is very long, and you have a piece of corpse flesh on one part of the floor, and the plank is overhanging that corpse flesh, and then on the other side you have a piece of food. The halacha is that everything that is under this ohel will become tameh because of the corpse flesh, provided that the plank is elevated above the floor at least 1 tefach. So that's mevias atuma. It collects the tumah underneath this ohel. It's not called an ohel unless it's 1 tefach elevated above the ground. Furthermore, if it's elevated 1 tefach above the ground, then anything that's above that plank is blocked from the tumah. The plank blocks the tumah from traveling above the plank. So nothing above the plank will become tameh. But if it's lower than 1 tefach height off the ground, so then that's bokeya. That tumah breaks through, so to speak, and that plank does not block it. So you see that a 1 tefach airspace is considered to be a blocker, is considered to be a solid impediment for everything that's underneath it. And as a result, if you have 1 layer of schach and 1 tefach space, and below that 1 tefach space you have another layer of schach, that bottom layer of schach is not kosher anymore because it's blocked, so to speak. So that's one opinion. So Rav Chisda v'Rabba bar Rav Huna Amri Arba'a. They say no. They're not as machmir. They say it has to be a 4 tefach gap, vertical gap, between the lower schach and the upper schach, in order for the lower schach to be puzzle. And why is that? Shalom atzino makom chashuv pachos me'arba. Because when it comes to the laws of Shabbos, we want to define what a domain is. It's like a rishus hayachid or a karmelis can only be defined as a 4 by 4 tefach space. And therefore, you find that 4 tefachim is the criterion to define a completely different sector or a halachic domain. And therefore, if you want to give this the status of a completely distinct and separate halachic domain that blocks the lower sukkah, it's got to be 4 tefachim height. Ushmuel Amar Asara. And Shmuel says, like we paskin, that no, it has to be a full 10 tefachim distance from the lower sukkah to the upper sukkah. And my time of Shmuel. And what's the reason? Kehechshera kach pisula. Ma hechshera ba'asara, af pisula ba'asara. That the way that you machshir the sukkah is the same way that you disqualify a sukkah. You need a kosher sukkah on the top floor in order to make the lower sukkah not a sukkah anymore, right? And what's the definition of a kosher sukkah? 10 tefachim height. So that's the reason why Shmuel says it's got to be 10 tefachim high. So now we're going to challenge Shmuel's shita in just a moment. Now let's look at our Mishnah. Rabbi Yehuda Omer im ein diurin be'elyona hatachtona kishera. Rabbi Yehuda had said that if there are no inhabitants, you see, the Chachamim said, anytime you've got a sukkah above a sukkah, the bottom sukkah is puzzle. Rabbi Yehuda comes along and says it depends. If there are no inhabitants in the upper sukkah, then the lower sukkah is kosher. So my ein diurin, what does that mean if there are no inhabitants? Ilema diurin mamash, atu diurin kagarmi. So the Gemara says, what does it mean? It means it depends on whether there are people there at the time or not. And then when I want to sit in my lower sukkah, why should that be the criterion? Since when does having human beings in a space above my sukkah determine whether my sukkah is kosher or not? That doesn't seem to make any sense. Elalav, my ein diurin kol she'ena re'uya l'dira. So rather, what must Rabbi Yehuda mean? He means that if it's possible for people to inhabit the upper sukkah, then the lower sukkah is pasul. But if it's not possible for people to inhabit the upper sukkah, then the lower sukkah is kosher. Vehechidami. So what's the illustration that it's not possible for people to inhabit it? Delo gavora asara must mean that the upper sukkah is shorter than 10 tvachim height, so it's not inhabitable. So if that's the time when Rabbi Yehuda holds that the bottom sukkah is kosher, michlal the Tanakama savar afal pisha ena re'uya l'dira pesula. It must mean that the Chachamim who argue with Rabbi Yehuda hold that even when the sukkah above is less than 10 tefachim, it's also pasul. This is a kasha on Shmuel, because Shmuel says that according to the Chachamim, if the upper sukkah is less than 10 tefachim, then the bottom sukkah is kosher. If that's the case, then what's the machlokes between the Chachamim and Rabbi Yehuda? According to what we're saying now, they seem to be saying exactly the same thing, right? That's the kasha on Shmuel. According to the other two opinions, it's not a problem, because a sukkah can be uninhabitable and yet still create a problem according to the other two opinions, according to the Chum. But according to Shmuel, which it's dependent upon it being a normal inhabitable sukkah, so then how is he any different from Rabbi Yehuda? So Ki Asa Ravdimi Amar Amri B'mar Rav, he explains the teretz from Eretz Yisrael to defend Shmuel. Im ein hatachtona yechola lekabel karim uksasos shel Elyona hatachtona kishera. He explained as follows, that Rabbi Yehuda is not talking necessarily about the height of the sukkah. He could very well be talking about a sukkah that's higher than 10 tfachim, and he is prepared to say that such a sukkah at certain situations could still not be a problem for the lower sukkah. How is that? Because he's talking about a regular sukkah, but that the floor of that upper floor sukkah is not, you can't stand on it, because the schach that divides between the upper sukkah and the lower sukkah is not sturdy enough to support people's weight, and it's not even sturdy enough to support the weight of the pillows and the cushions and the furniture and the chairs that are in that sukkah. And as a result, that's why Rabbi Yehuda says you don't look at that upper sukkah as really being a sukkah, and that's why the bottom sukkah is kosher. The Chachamim disagree. The Chachamim say it's not dependent upon the ability for it to support the weight of people and their furniture. It's dependent upon its structural viability.
Is there a problem with the fact that the sail is coming from the Elyon? In other words, that's if my schach doesn't create the sail, but the sail coming from the coming from a separate schach. So the Gemara, it seemed to be saying that it's not dependent. That's not the criterion, even though we've seen that before. But the criterion seems to be that it's a sukkah beneath a sukkah. That was the pasuk. The pasuk had indicated that to us. In any event, michlal. So the Gemara says, I don't understand what you're saying. Michlal the Tanakama savar afal pi she'ena re'uya lekabel pesula. You mean to tell me that according to the Chachamim, even if it's not inhabitable, even if no one can actually use it functionally as a sukkah, according to the Tanakama, it's going to be a problem just because it's higher than 10 tfachim? The Gemara is questioning that because it doesn't seem to make any sense. According to the Chachamim, it shouldn't be any more of a sukkah if it's lower than 10 tfachim than if it's higher than 10 tfachim and people can't use it. Why should that be a problem if the whole issue is you can't have a sukkah beneath a sukkah, and this functionally cannot be used as a sukkah, so then why should that pose a problem to the lower sukkah? That's the Gemara's question. Why should it be that if it's higher than, the upper sukkah is higher than 10 tfachim, it should pose a problem if people can't use it? So the Gemara's answer is, Ika beinayu di'acholu lekabel al yedei adechak. So the Gemara's conclusion is, you're right. Even according to the Chachamim, if it's completely not usable, so they too will agree that it doesn't pose a problem for the lower sukkah. What's the machlokus between Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim? According to the Chachamim, if it's usable with difficulty, so then it creates a problem for the bottom sukkah. But according to Rabbi Yehuda, if people normally wouldn't use it, so then
it doesn't create a problem at all, even if a person could use it al yedei hadechak. What's al yedei hadechak? The thing I'm thinking of is that you've got like a regular sukkah that you build in your backyard. Every couple of feet, it has a solid cross beam to support the schach. So, with difficulty, I could prevent myself from falling through if I'm very careful and I step over like very carefully. So for that, the Chachamim would say that makes the upper sukkah with difficulty functional and therefore creates a problem for the lower sukkah.
Yeah.
For Rabbi Yehuda, it doesn't.
Yeah.
Benny, you okay?
Yeah.
Everything all right? Okay. All right, great.
Be able to see the stars a little bit.
Thank you.
All right,
You
great.
have to be able to see the stars a
You
little
start the Mishnah now.
Yeah, we're going to start the Mishnah now. Okay.
bit. You have to be able to see the stars a little bit. If you have another sukkah
Start
on top, you can't see anything.
So as we'll see, there is a concept of seeing the stars, but it's not ma'akev. So there are some of these sukkah mats, you can't see the stars. It's still kasher eschach. Okay, Mishnah. There's, midrashically, agadically, there's a benefit of seeing the stars because that reminds you of Shamayim. But there's no halachic requirement to see the stars.
But the first opinion is a tefach. Who can get into a tefach sukkah?
You're right. According to those shitas, it doesn't, even though it may not have a shame sukkah in the sense of practically being able to use it, but it has this shame sukkah because it has schach over it that acts as an impediment for the lower sukkah. Let's go on to the next Mishnah. Next Mishnah is Pireis aleh hasadin mipnei hachama o tachteha mipnei hanesher. Now we're talking about a person who wants to spread something over or under his schach. Sometimes it's hard to imagine on a day like this that people get really hot in the sukkah, but it does happen, right? So let's say you have a sukkah and it's really, really, really hot, and so you want to take a sheet and spread it over the schach to act as an insulation and a protection from the heat and the sun.
Here we would say because of the rain.
Here we would say because of the rain, right? But the Mishnah says because of the sun. Or let's say you want to spread a sheet underneath your schach because your schach is made out of exfoliating branches and the leaves keep dropping off into your chicken soup and you had enough already. So you want to take a sheet and you want to put it underneath the schach to catch all the droppings. Next case. Shapires al gabi hakinof. Now, if you look at the word kinof very carefully, it sounds like the word canopy, right? That's exactly what it means. If, let's say, you have a bed, and you want to sleep in the sukkah, but your bed has a canopy, so there's a sheet over the canopy that's blocking between you and the schach. In all of those cases, it's pesula. Aval poresu al gabi naklite hamita, but what you are allowed to do is you are allowed to spread a canopy or a sheet over a two-post canopy. Now the difference, or I would call it like a pup tent. Isn't that what they call a pup tent? Yeah, that's like a pup tent, right? Isn't that what it's called? Or am I just...
No, that is a pup tent.
A pup tent, right? It's because it's basically comes to a point on top, so it's not a horizontal roof that divides between you and the schach. In that case, it's okay. Now, I want you to remember this issue of the canopy versus the four-post versus the two-post canopy, because we're going to see a lot of permutations. This Mishnah is ambiguous enough for us to have a whole bunch of different ways of understanding when the canopy is a problem, when the canopy is not a problem. So we'll do that momentarily.
Like a TP or a wigwam?
Yeah, just don't get too tense. Amar Rav Chisda, Rav Chisda says, Lo shanu ela mipnei hanesher, avol lenaosa keshera. So Rav Chisda says that it's only a problem when you want to put the sheet underneath your schach if it's to catch the droppings, because then it's a protective placement. However, if the purpose of putting up the sheet is, let's say you want to put up a tapestry, you want your sukkah to be like the Sistine Chapel, so that when you look up, you've got beautiful artwork, right? So then, in that situation, it's not a problem because it's not meant as a protective cover, it's meant as artwork, and therefore it doesn't constitute an impediment between you and the schach. So the Gemara says, Pshita mipnei hanesher t'nan. Well, that's self-evident. I mean, that's what the Mishnah had said. It's only because you wanted to catch the droppings that it's a problem. If it's just for artistic reasons, then that's implicit in the Mishnah. So the Gemara says, no, it's not, because Ma'u Detema, Hu Adin Da'afilu L'Na'os, Avahayte Katani Mibnei Aneshu Orcha Demilsa Katani, Kamash Malon. You might have thought that the Mishnah is not discriminating between a protective canopy versus an artistic canopy or sheet, and the only reason that it listed that it's for protection is because that's normally why you would put up a sheet underneath your schach. So kamash malan that it's a halachic distinction as well. Lema misayele. Let us say that the following brisa supports Rav Chisda. The brisa says, Sicha chaki hilchasa, a person places kosher schach on top of his sukkah. V'itra bakramin uva sadinim hamitsuyarin, and then you decorate your sukkah with these tapestries and woven pieces of artwork. V'talaba egozim shkedim afarsikim v'rimonim parchili anovim v'itro shel shibolim yeno shmanim muslatos. And you also, if you hang up, like by a string, like people still do today, you hang nuts and almonds and peaches and pomegranates. Today they're made in China, they're from plastic, but in the old days they were real, right? Parchile anovim, or let's say, right, or you put the maize, right? You put clusters of grapes, or you put like bundles of wheat, or you bottles of wine, oil, and flour, and you hang those by a string hanging from your schach. So asur lihistapek mehen, you're not allowed to benefit from those hangings and tapestries and art and foods. Ad motzah yom tov ha'acharon shel chag, until Sukkot is over. It's just like the atzei sukkah you're not allowed to benefit from, like we learned yesterday. So to the noye sukkah, the decorations of the sukkah, you cannot get any personal benefit. So you can't take that corn on the cob, Rabbi, and just say, I'm really hungry, I'll take a bite out of that corn. Right? You can't do that on Sukkot. V'im hisna aleim hakol lefitano. But if you made an explicit declaration before you hung up the decorations, and you said, I plan on using this when I'll use this as my salad dressing, this bottle of oil, I'll use it as my salad dressing when I need it, so then everything works according to your Tanai. But the Gemara says, you see from this brisa the proof that hanging tapestries that are, beneath the schach are kosher, because it's for artwork, it's not for protection. So the Gemara says, that's not a raya, because dilma min atzad. Because maybe it's talking about tapestries on the wall, not on the ceiling. So you have no raya from that brisa. So now itmar. Now let's see a statement which seems to be in accord with Rav Chisda. No ye sukkah ein ma'atin b'sukkah. The decorations of the sukkah do not diminish the size of a sukkah. Now this has two ramifications. One is, let's say your sukkah is higher than 20 amos. You can't say, well, I'll spread a beautiful sheet of, a beautiful tapestry, under 20 amos, and that'll make the sukkah kosher. It doesn't, because the schach is above 20 amos. It's still possible. Let's say, the other ramification is, let's say the sukkah is exactly 10 tfachim high, and you hang a tapestry just beneath the schach. So that also will not invalidate it. And Tosfos points out, even though we learned previously that if you have leaves protruding out of the schach in exactly a 10 tefach high sukkah, that invalidates the sukkah. But here it's different, because it's a stinky, yucky sukkah. But over here, that's art, right? So therefore, even though you feel cramped, it's still habitable, right? So those are the two ramifications. However, Amar Ravashu min atzad mima'atin. That's only true that it doesn't affect the vertical height of the sukkah, but the horizontal width of the sukkah is affected by if you have vertical tapestries that are hanging, and let's say you have it exactly 7 by 7 tefach sukkah, and then you put a piece of tapestry straight down the middle of the sukkah to divide it in half, that will invalidate the sukkah, says Rav Ashi. And the reason is because you can't get your body and your table in there anymore. Like Beis Shammai had said, it has to be big enough for you to fit in there and to be able to reside there. But now it's not fittable anymore. So therefore, that does invalidate the sukkah. So Avdei de Rav Ashi, it mishale kusunta b'maya v'ishtatcha amatalalta. That the servant of whose name was Minyamin, he was the servant of Rav Ashi, his tunic got wet one day, and he wanted to hang it up to dry. it was during Sukkot, so he threw it over the schach because that was where the sun was beating down. It was a clear area. He figured he'd let it dry on top of the sukkah. So Amalei Ravashi Dalye de lo lemru kamasachachi bedavar makabel tuma. So Ravashi says, no, listen, you got to remove it because it's maris ayin. People are going to think that I'm using a piece of fabric like a sheet over my schach, and they're going to think that that's kosher, and it's not. So v'hakachazule derativa. So the servant said back to him, Rebbe, what's the problem? People can see that it's wet and it's being hung out to dry. So Ravashi said, L'chiyav shakam yinalach. No, I'm saying that maybe you'll forget about it and it'll dry out, and during that time when it's already dry, people won't realize that it was put up to dry, and then there's a problem of maris ayin. Itmar. Next, the statement that was made is no ye sukkah hamuflagin mimena arba'a. Now let's say you have sukkah decorations that are at a vertical distance of 4 tfachim below the schach. And let's say you get one of these really, really cool made in China paper mache things that, like you buy it flat and then you open it up, and it's like this whole ganze elaborate geschäft, right? And you're sitting right under it. It's 4 tfachim distance from the schach, so it's not really ancillary to the schach anymore that you can say it's not a problem. So this is where you have your machlokas. So Rav Nachman Omar Kishe, Rav Nachman says it's still kosher. It's still not. It still doesn't present a problem. And Rav Chisda, Rabbi Baravuna Amri Pesula, they say that it's puzzle because they hold that it's like an ohel hamafsik. It's like an overhang that acts as an impediment between you and the schach.
If you weren't sitting directly underneath those 45, you can sit on the side.
Yeah, then you sit on the side, so right?
It doesn't puzzle the sukkah. It puzzles that spot.
It puzzles that spot, right? Rav Chisda, unless the sukkah is so small that without that spot you don't have 7 by 7 anymore. Okay, Rav Chisda v'Rabba bar Rav Huna iklolu beireish galusa. So these two rabbis who were machmir on such a decoration, they once came to the Reish Galusa, and you know that Rav Nachman was like the chief rabbi of the Reish Galusa. So, and Rav Nachman was the one who had said that it's kosher. So here you have a little bit of a political issue. So Agninu Rav Nachman besuka sheno yeha muflogin mimena arba'a tfachim. Rav Nachman said, here, Rabbi Isai, I'll give you lodging for the night. You can sleep in the sukkah. And the sukkah had decorations that were lower than 4 tfachim from the ceiling. So according to their shita, it wouldn't be kosher to sleep there. Ishtiku v'lo amr le v'lo midi. But they remained silent. They didn't protest. Amr lahu hadr behu rabbanan mishmai taihu. So Rav Nachman says, aha, does this mean that you rabbis finally see the light and you agree that it's not a problem? So Amri Lei, no. Anan shluchei mitzvah anan upaturun min hasukah. They said, no, Rebbe, sorry, it's not because of that we're silent. It's because we're on our way to do a mitzvah. We're on a delegation. We're on a mission, and we're doing a mitzvah. And a person is going to do a mitzvah is patur min hasukah. And the proof that Rashi brings is that we'll see later on. There's a mitzvah to be makabel pnei rabo on the moed. There's a mitzvah to greet your Rebbe, to go see your Rebbe on Chol HaMoed Pesach and Chol HaMoed Sukkos, so much so that you're allowed to travel even without a sukkah in order to go see your Rebbe. So you see that if you're going to do a mitzvah, you're putter from sukkah, and that's why we didn't protest. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel. Now let's go to our stories of the canopy, because we're going to see a number of different shitas. It may get a little confusing, but just to give you a little bit of an introduction, there are multiple different permutations of canopies. We learned in the Mishnah that there are 4-post canopies and there are 2-post canopies. The 4-post canopies are called konif or kanofos, right, from the word canopy. And the 2-post canopies are called naklitin. Just remember that word. There's another word that we're going to be introduced to, which is called kila. Kila is where you have a 4-post structure around your bed, but you don't have a permanent canopy affixed to the posts. And it gives you the opportunity to take a sheet and hang it over, but that's more of a sort of a makeshift kind of thing. It's not a permanent built-in canopy that's part of the bed. Now this is significant because in defining what constitutes an ohel that creates an obstruction between myself and my schach, permanence is going to be a factor. Another factor is going to be how high is that canopy above the bed. If it's higher than 10 tfachim, there's more of a reason to say that it's a real obstruction. And if it's lower than 10 tefachim, then maybe there's an argument to say that it's not as much. So you have all of these different permutations to give us the next sugya. So Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, Mutter Lishan Bekila Besukkah Afal Pishi Yesh Lagag, V'hu She'ena Gavoa Asara. It is permitted to sleep under a kila in a sukkah, which is that, like I said, that makeshift canopy, even if it is completely horizontal and is on 4 posts, provided that it's lower than 10 tefachim, because then it doesn't constitute a real ohel. Tashma, come and listen to the Brisa. Hayashen bekila b'sukkah lo yatsa yedei chavaso. The Brisa says exactly not that way. The Brisa says that sleeping under a kila is problematic. You're not fulfilling your mitzvah. So the Gemara answers, Hacha b'may askina kishigavo asar. That Brisa is talking about where the kila is 10 tefachim above the bed, and that's why it's a problem, because it's a more of an ohel structure, because it's 10 tefachim high. Meisvei. Now let's challenge from another brisa. Hayashen tachas hamita b'sukkah lo yatsa yedei chavasa. If you sleep under a bed in your sukkah, let's say you have a bed and you decide you want to sleep under the bed. So the bed itself is an obstruction between you and the schach. And that's why you're not yotze. Presumably the bed is lower than 10 tefachim and it's still a problem. And it's still like a makeshift, it's a temporary overhang because people move the beds around all the time. So the Gemara says, Hatir Gamashmul b'mita gavo asara. There too, it's an unusual bed which is elevated above the ground 10 tefachim before you get to the mattress, before you get to to whatever surface that a person lies on. Toshma, listen to the next brisa. O shapires al gabi kinofos pisula. The Brisa had said that if you spread a sheet over kinofos, which is a 4-post canopy, then it's problematic. So the Gemara says, no, hasam nami de gavi asara. There too, it's talking about a canopy that's 10 tefachim high. Frankly, the Gemara, you can't say that. V'halo ketani hachi. That's not what it says in the Brisa. The Tanya, naklitin shnayim v'kinofos arba. The definition of naklitin is a 2-post canopy, like that pup tent, and the definition of kinofos is a 4-post canopy. Pires al gabi kinofos pesula al gabi naklitin keshera. If you spread a sheet over the 4-post canopy, it's pasul. If you spread a post over the 2-post canopy, it's kosher. Uvilvad shelo yihiyu naklitin gavon min amita asara. But with one proviso. The only time naklitin is kosher is if it's lower than 10 tefachim. So what do you see from that statement? Michlal de kinofos afal pisha in gavon asara. That indicates that when you're dealing with a 4-post canopy, even if it's less than 10 tefachim high, it's still going to be pasul. So how can you, Shmuel, say that as long as the kila canopy is lower than 10 tefachim, then it's not a problem? You see that the kinofos canopy, which is also 4 posts, is a problem even if it's lower than 10 tefachim. The Gemara answers, shiny kinofos de kivi'i, answers the Gemara, and this is what I foreshadowed for you, that there's a difference between a permanent canopy, which is a fixed part of the furniture of the bed, versus a kila, which is a makeshift canopy. When you're dealing with a makeshift canopy, then you can distinguish between if it's above 10 tefachim or if it's below 10 tefachim. But when you're dealing with a permanent fixture of a canopy, so then, even if it's lower than 10 tefachim, it's problematic.
There's no question of chatzitza here between you and the schach, for example.
That's the issue.
If I take a lean-to, which is really low to the ground, that's a 10, right? Really, really low to the ground. It's very, very low, and I just squeeze into that thing. But now
you'll see. We're going to talk about a lower canopy acting as a blanket. In other words, the question is, what's the difference between being in a sleeping bag or being under a canopy? So we'll see that the Gemara will discuss this issue. So the Gemara now says, "Veharei sukkah al gabe sukkah de kavia." But I don't understand, says the Gemara. When you have one sukkah on top of another sukkah, that's a permanent structure. That's fixed in. That's built into the structure. V'amar Shmuel kehech sheira kach pesula, and Shmuel still says that if it's higher than 10 tefachim, then it's a problem. But if it's lower than 10 tefachim, it's kosher. So you see that even a fixed structure that's lower than 10 tefachim is okay. So how can the Brisa say that kinofos, which is a fixed canopy, a part of the furniture, that even if it's lower than 10 tefachim, it's a problem? The Gemara answers, you're comparing apples and oranges. Amri hasam de la mifsal sukkah ba'asara hacha de la shavuye ohala batzra me asara nami havi ohala. The difference is that Shmuel says the criterion for a sukkah al gav sukkah to be a problem is, do you have in the upper floor an actual sukkah? right? The criterion is it a sukkah or not? Anything less than 10 tefachim is not a sukkah, so it's not a sukkah tachas a sukkah. So therefore it's not a problem. But over here the criterion is what is an ohel? Not what is a sukkah, but what is an ohel? The definition of an ohel is any overhang that has a sense of permanence to it. So even if it's lower than 10 tefachim, but it has a sense of permanence like these kinofos, so then it creates an obstruction between me and the schach, and it's a problem, right? If it's not permanent, then it has to be 10 tefachim high to have enough of the chashivas to create an obstruction. Okay, Amar Rav Tachlifa Baravimi Amar Shmuel Hayashen Bekila Arum Motzi Rosha Chutz Lakila V'Koy Kriyashma. If a person is sleeping under a makeshift canopy and he's naked, so then all he has to do, you're not allowed to recite Kriya Shema Keneged Ha'erva. You can't be naked when you're reciting Kriya Shema. But let's say you're in a sleeping bag naked. So just poke your head out of the sleeping bag, and that creates a separation between your body and your head, and you can recite Kriya Shema. In a similar vein, just stick your head out of the area where the canopy is spread over you, and you can recite Kriya Shema, and you're fine. So Meisvei, so let's challenge that. Its Bryce says exactly not that way. Hayashin bekila arum lo yotzi rosha chutz l'kila v'yikar kriyashma. That it says you can't do that in the Bryce. So the Gemara answers hacha b'mayaskinan kishigavo asara. So the answer is that when the kila is 10 tefachim high, so then it's considered to be a structural ohel and no longer considered to be part of your like a sleeping bag, and therefore just sticking your head out is not good enough. But if it's lower than 10 tefachim and it's makeshift to begin with, then you can consider it like a blanket or a sleeping bag, and therefore sticking your head out is okay. Hachanami mistavra, it makes sense to create that distinction. Midikatani seifa halamazeh doma. The brisa at the end part says, what is it analogous to when you have this kila that is problematic? La omeid bavayis arum shelo yotzi rosha chutz lachalon v'yikar kriyashma shma mina. So you see very clearly the brisa says it's analogous to being in a house while you're naked and sticking your head out the window. Now, wouldn't that be a spectacle? That'll get the neighbors talking, huh? Right? You stick your head out the window and you want to say Kriya Shema, and you're naked. The rest of your naked body is in the house. That's not going to work because there's nothing covering your body. So the same thing is true by Akila. Now the Gemara says, "Ubayas nami apol pishen gavoa asara kiven de kavia ohalahu de logara mikinofos." But the Gemara says, "But you should know that there is one difference between Akila and a house. If a kila, because it's of its makeshift nature, if it's lower than 10 tefachim, you can treat it like a blanket and it's okay. It allows you to recite Kriya Shema. However, a house, even if it's a structure made out of bricks, even if it's lower than 10 tefachim, if you're naked and you stick your head out the window, that's not going to be good because, like we said before, if it's a permanent structure, then it has the status of an ohel, not the status of a blanket or a sleeping bag. And therefore, just like a permanently affixed canopy is like an ohel, so too this house is like an ohel, and it doesn't allow you to recite Kriya Shema just by sticking your head outside of it. Now, Lishna Achrina Amrila. There's a whole different version of this whole Shakla Vitaria, and it'll just take us a minute. We'll get to the Mishnah in no time. You'll see. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel. Rav Yehuda says in the name of Shmuel, Murta Lishon Bekilas Chasanim Besukkah Lefi She'ein Lagag. It is permitted to sleep in a groomsman's canopy. This is sort of like typically what a chassan would have the night of his the wedding. They'd put a canopy, which is like, but in that pup tent structure where there's only 2 posts, you're allowed to sleep in that in a sukkah because it has no horizontal roof, and therefore it doesn't create an obstruction between you and the schach. Afal pisha gavo asar, and that's true even if it is 10 tefachim high. So Meisvei, let's challenge that. Hayashen bekila b'sukkah lo yatsa yedei chavaso. That if you sleep in a kila, then you don't fulfill your obligation. So hacha b'mayaskinan kishiyesh lagag. Because there are 2 types of kila, which is a temporary canopy. There's the 2-post kind, and then there's the 4-post kind.
What if using this example? If he's also a sikh mitzvah if he's using a chassan.
I guess because the only time we say osek b'mitzvahs patur min mitzvahs when you don't have any other option.
We had an example of Nachman also. He said they sat in the sukkah
because they didn't have any other option. Where else were they going to sleep?
doesn't mean he's a chassan. He slept in kilas chassan.
Right, and also kilas chasanim doesn't literally mean that you're a chassan. It just means that this is the type of structure that you're dealing with. Because after all, you're not allowed to get married on Chol HaMoed anyway, so it wouldn't be relevant. Anyway, so the Gemara's the Gemara's answer is that you have to distinguish between a kila that is 4 posts and a kila that's 2 posts. Tashma. But look at the next price. Naklitin shnayim v'kinofos arba. Naklitin is the 2-post canopy. Kinofos is the 4-post canopy. Pires lagabi kinofos psul lagabi niklitin kisher obat shlo yunaklitin gavo min amita asar tvachim. That if you spread a canopy over the kinofos, the 4 posts, it's puzzle. Over the naklitin, the 2 posts, it's kosher, provided that the naklitin is less than 10 tvachim. Hagavon min hamita asar pesula. Afal pisha in lagag. So you see that even naklitin is going to be puzzle if it's higher than 10 tvachim. Not like you, Shmuel, just said that even if it's higher than 10 tvachim, it's kosher because it has no horizontal roof. So you see it's a direct steer to what you're saying. So shani naklitin de kivi. So the answer is that you have to distinguish between a temporary canopy, which is the kilas chasanim, versus the permanent, a fixed canopy, which is the naklitin. So you see many, many different levels, right? You have the lowest level, which is a kila, temporary, and it's a 2-post temporary. Then you have the next level up, which is the 4-post temporary. Then the next level, which is naklitin, which is permanent, that's 2 posts. And then you have the permanent 4-post. So depending upon its level of permanence and its level of chashivus, will determine whether it's an obstruction or not. And you have different opinions about it. So the Gemara says, Ikavi lihavi kikinofos. So the Gemara says, if you're telling me that naklitin is more of a problem because it's a permanent fixture, so then why are you making this distinction of whether it's higher than 10 tvachim or lower than 10 tvachim? Anything that's permanent should be like kinofos and automatically be puzzle even if it's lower than 10 tvachim. So the Gemara answers, Lagabi kinofos lo kavi, lagabi kila kavi. Answers the Gemara because it's in the middle. It's not as much of an obstruction as kinofos, because that's 4 posts, this is 2 posts, but it's more of an obstruction than a kilas chasanim, which is temporary. So therefore, using these 3 different gradations, that which is most liberal is something that's temporary in 2 posts, and therefore it could even be higher than 10 tvachim. The most chamor is 4 posts and permanent, and even if it's lower than 10 tvachim, it's puzzle. The middle is this naklitin, which is 2 posts and permanent, so vis-a-vis the kila, it's considered to be more permanent, and therefore if it's higher than 10 tvachim, it's puzzle. But vis-a-vis the kinofos, which is 4 posts, it's not as much of an obstruction, and therefore if it's lower than 10 tvachim, it's okay. Now, Darash Rabbi Baravuna, mutter lishon bekila afal pisha yesh lagag, afal pisha gvo asara. He's even more liberal than Shmuel. And he says you can sleep under a kila, which means that it's makeshift, it's temporary, even if it has 4 posts. And even if it's higher than 10 tvachim, right, because of the fact that it's only temporary, that does not create an obstruction. Kiman ke Rebbe Yehuda. He must go like Rebbe Yehuda. Da Amar, lo asi ohel harai umavatel ohel keva. Rebbe Yehuda holds that as long as something is temporary, it never obstructs the permanent ohel that is above it. And therefore, as long as you have the permanent structure of the sukkah above it, then that is what is the prevailing structure that you're sleeping under. And anything that's temporary that's below it does not create an obstruction. Ditnan, as the Mishnah says, Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Noagin hayinu lishon tachas hamita bifnei hazakenim. The Rabbi Yehuda says, we used to have a minhag that we used to sleep under our beds in the presence of our elders when we were little kids in the sukkah. That there wasn't room for everyone to sleep on beds, so we slept under the beds. So you see that even though a bed is an obstruction, nevertheless, since it's a temporary obstruction, it's not a problem. So v'leima halacha ka Rebbe Yehuda. So the Gemara says, why didn't Rabbi Baravuna just say, I paskin like Rebbe Yehuda? That and because that's implicit in the Mishnah. So the Gemara answer is, Iyamar halacha ka Rebbe Yehuda hava mina hanimili mita de lagaba asuya aval kila de lotoch asuya imalo kamash malon. That I might have thought that if he just said the halacha like Rebbe Yehuda, maybe only when you sleep under a bed it's not an obstruction, obstruction because you're not utilizing the intended functionality of that bed. The intended functionality of the bed is sleep on top of the bed and not to sleep under it. By sleeping under it, you're not creating an obstruction between you and the schach because you're not using it for its intended function. But a kila, but a canopy, even though it's makeshift, you might have thought that since I'm using it for its intended functionality, which is to use the underneath of that canopy, then maybe it is an obstruction. And therefore it comes along Rabbi to say, the time of the Rabbi Yehuda lo asi al ol Aryai mavatul ohel keva lo shnamita v'lo shnakila. He comes along to teach me that no, the criterion is not whether I'm using it with its intended functionality, but rather, is it temporary or is it permanent? And across the board, I hold like Rabbi Yehuda, and Rabbi Yehuda's shita is that anything that's a temporary obstruction that's going to be removed very shortly does not create an obstruction between myself and the sukkah. Makes no difference whether it's a bed or whether it's a kila. Have a wonderful day.